Hi, I'm Whitney Sheridan from the School of Public Policy at Penn State. I'll be speaking with you about strategies for career and leadership success with our Director of Professional Development and Student Engagement, Catherine Baumgardner. Catherine, hi.
Hi, Whitney. Great to be with you again today.
Great to have you. Before we get started with today's topic, navigating organizational change, I want to encourage your participation today and invite you to type your questions in the Q&A box at any time throughout the discussion. Change is something that we all have to deal with at some point in our lives. And as this pandemic has shown us, but in the organizational setting, changing ourselves and helping others to embrace change can be very challenging. To help us share some perspective on navigating change, we have a very special alumni guest with us today. A graduate of Penn State, Kevin Richmond received his Bachelor of Arts degrees in International Politics and Economics. He holds an MBA in Strategy, Change Management, and Marketing from the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. In his current position as the head of customer experience at Column, Richmond supports newspapers, government, and the private sector to ensure the public receives essential and critical information it needs. Kevin, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Yeah, thanks, Whitney.
So, we really are excited to have you here with us. And I know Catherine wants to get this, she's eager to get this discussion started. She really was excited to have this topic discussed as part of this series. So Catherine, I'm going to let you take it away a little bit here.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for joining us today, Kevin. For our listeners, last month, our discussion focused on advice and feedback from the hiring and recruitment perspective. And so we're continuing this journey of helping you to develop skills that are relevant in the workplace by having Kevin with us today. So we're going to dig a bit more deeply into a success factor around an experience and perspective that Kevin is going to share with us with both adapting to change personally and helping others in organizations to embrace instead of dread change. Now, as your listeners, as our viewers or listeners, I want you to think about your answers to these questions. The first question is, who wants change? Who wants to change? And who wants to lead change? Whenever I use these questions with a live group, I typically see a lot of hands go up when we talk about who wants to change or who wants change. Then when I say who wants to change, the hands go down and fewer hands go up. And finally, who wants to lead change, I may end up being the only person in the room with my hand up. So I suspect that maybe you had a similar response. Wanting to change sounds like a good thing. Wanting change sounds good. We all say, yeah, change. When we think about wanting to change, it's a bit of a different perspective because it means we need to do something personally. And then leading that change means we need to bring a lot of people along with us. You know, Kevin, as I think about the many theories of change, there are lots of theories out there and lots of thought leaders. We have Levin, who's the father of change with his unfreeze, change, and refreeze theories. We have McKenzie with the 7S theory. We have Cotter with the 8 stages of change. We have Nudge with the idea of pulling and pushing change. There's ADKAR, which is a more goal-oriented approach. And so there's a plethora of theories out there, which our participants today can certainly read more about. But what I'm really interested today is really hearing less about the theories and more about the practice that you've experienced in your broad career. So perhaps I could ask you to start us off by sharing some of your experience with change. And what approach do you both personally and professionally take in navigating organizational change?
Yeah. So again, thanks everyone for having me, specifically Whitney and Catherine, but everyone that's here. I'll first say that I don't have all the answers. Everything that I come with is from a lived experience of having led this and done this, but other people may have different perspectives, and that's totally legitimate and okay as well. And so, you know, one, if you guys have questions, feel free to chat them over because I'm happy to have this be demand driven and you guys take this where you want to. So before I joined the startup that I'm in now, I was actually in the federal government for 10 years. And so I was during a time of rapid change, which comes from an administration change where priorities rapidly change, like after, on a flip of a switch, suddenly like your priorities change. Um, I started at the very bottom, and like so most of the change was done to me rather than me being a part of it at the beginning. But also that creates some unique opportunities for you where you can help bolster your career, and help get involved with leading change pretty early. The other thing that I'll say is I've done change from the higher level. So the organization that I worked at, which was General Services Administration, which is a 15,000 person government agency. I had to lead them for what a virtual workforce looks like. And this was 7 years ago at this point. So very like timely right now. Didn't seem timely at the time, but trying to move 15,000 person government organization to saying, what does it look like to be 100% virtual is a very, very challenging task. And so, other than that, I also spent 2 years at the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, working on public sector innovation. So I was working with other governments on helping support them leading change, where while we would have loved to lead it ourselves to help them, it was probably better to be led from within, and us being in the background supporting them and helping positioning them to help support change with their citizenry as well as in government in general. And now I'm helping support change in newspapers. So like I'm staying with the groups that are underserved by technology, where generally change is related to technology in some capacity. And so it's been really interesting working with small newspapers trying to support local journalism, which is just so critical to uninformed citizenry across the US, which I know is like a really critical issue right now, and helping support them become sustainable. And like, how does that work and how does information get distributed?
We want to remind everybody that this conversation is for you, our participants. So at any time throughout the discussion, please use that Q&A window. We're looking forward to your questions for Kevin. He's here to answer your thoughts on organizational change, on how to navigate it. Kevin, what about a change that worked well for you? And can you tell us what made that change successful?
Yeah, so the changes that everyone generally refers to that work well is when you have intrinsic motivation. Like I want to change and therefore it's really easy to do so, right? Like I want to go exercise more. And so therefore I'm going to get into that routine. Maybe not a good one because I've been lazy for the past couple months, but like generally, if you're intrinsically motivated to do something, like you're in a good spot. You can do it. The more difficult changes are when you are helping trying to lead other people that may not be intrinsically motivated to change. So when I refer to the moving to a virtual workforce, right? There was a lot of components to that. There was policy components where policy people and lawyers typically don't like to say yes to things. There was a technology component of government's not the fastest at buying things. So how do you actually make sure that the technology is there? There was the managers that needed support in terms of managing their employees and how to do that in a virtual environment. And then there was the skills component of, do people have the skills if they have the technology, if they have do they have the capabilities and skills, the KSAs, to be able to actually execute and be an effective worker from home? So that sounds very daunting, especially for 15,000 people, but it actually went surprisingly well. We had some hiccups along the way, and I'm happy to talk about some of those challenges as well and lessons learned. But in the end, like we changed policy, we trained employees, we trained managers, and like we were a case study for other agencies to do. Now, most of them ignored it, which is why some of the challenges that some of the governments agencies are having right now. But I would say the key success factors are: one, you had a sustained view from leadership that this is important. So typically you'll see in change efforts that leaders present this to their organization, but that means they've already decided this is a good idea and they've already gone through that mental transition. And so they're done. And so they're like, hey, I don't understand. Like this took me 6 months to be comfortable with. but
Right.
now I'm comfortable with it. I've presented it. Why is no one else comfortable with it? So having a leader that actually understood and we could remind them of how important like sustained effort was from a leadership perspective. Another piece was being able to iterate. So one of the biggest theories of change that like you will always see if you hire consultants is like you need to have this like 18-month game plan and you're going to have all the tactics defined and everything's going to go perfect. And then you get started and it is just chaos and nothing works as it's supposed to work. And so it becomes really important to be able to get in a habit of saying, consistently reflecting what is working, what is not working, what do we need to change, and how do we adapt? And so that iteration and adaptability is so important when you're talking about organizational change, both from like the leader of leading change perspective, but also from being like having change forced upon you.
Right.
We just I just hired an employee under me at Column, and I was telling her and I were chatting actually right before this. I was like, do not get emotionally invested into our processes and technologies because they change all the time. And so, you know, as long as you're understanding the purpose that you're trying to achieve and you can get people aligned on goals and purpose, and less aligned to I love this technology over this one or this process over this one, change becomes a little bit easier, but that's a really hard thing to cultivate within a larger organization.
And you mentioned, a lot of times the leadership has already embraced the change. They've known about this for 6 months. They're set to go. They've got it down. It's, after those 6 months that the staff members might be now just hearing about it, how do they cope with this change?
Well, they cope with it generally by talking trash behind leadership's back. I mean, let's be honest. Like that's a general coping mechanism.
That's the most honest answer.
But yeah, so look, you're going to get active resistance. That there are going to be people that don't want to change. In government, change is typically seen as a 4-year cycle and that you can wait out change. And like the next person will want something else. So you can just ignore this for long enough or put it off long enough. The other piece is that the people that succeed embrace it. And they don't embrace it by just saying like, this is the new way of doing things. Generally, when you are changing norms in an organization, of which if you're doing organizational change, you're changing process norms, technology norms, something, there's an opportunity to change more of them. And so typically what ends up happening with younger people in organizations that end up being really successful early is that they embrace the change, find opportunity in it, and there is generally ambiguity within, a change management process that allows you to own some things and allows you to be seen as a leader, a leader off the org chart of doing some of this. So we changed to Gmail, right? Well before like Gmail was a big thing in government. We switched to it. And just by me embracing that switch and knowing that I was decent at Gmail, I volunteered to help other employees and I got seen and positioned as someone that was willing to spend some of my time supporting other people over top of just like my work. Right. And then suddenly I was the representative for our 500-person organization for like this change effort, because like when people said, who do we want doing this? Everyone said, Kevin is the person that's helping everyone. So it just makes sense to just like put him in this role. And I did the same in data analytics before government did that. And like, I would hate to see any data scientists looking at the analytics that I was doing 10 years ago. But like no one was doing it. So it was a transition of crap. We have to move to a data-driven decision-making. And like, we don't know what that means and what that looks like and how to do that. And so just taking the data that you had available to you and showing that you have the proclivity to do that was just a huge way to take advantage and be seen as like an innovator within an organization. And so I think, yes, change will happen to you. You may not like it all the time, but you can resist and at times you should, especially if someone's doing something unethical or promoting you to do something unethical. But there are times when you can take a step back and say, like, where's the opportunity here? Where can I support and help, and where could I like maybe have another thing that I think needs to be changed that I can kind of like tag onto this, right? Oh, if we're doing process change, like what about this one as well? And say like, because this one's been bugging me and I have a good idea for how to resolve it. So there are a lot of opportunities there as well, but most people don't take advantage of it. And so I think because most people don't, it's a huge advantage if you can.
Great advice about being one of those informal leaders and embracing the change and kind of leading the way. Want to remind everybody that we're encouraging your questions for Kevin and questions on the navigating organizational change.
There's a lot to unpack about what you just said, Kevin.
Wow.
You talked a lot about leadership and how important it is for the leader to have a sustained vision and to have a clear picture. Oftentimes we go into, or we're being asked to change, but we don't know why. And we don't want to necessarily blindly follow, which is what can cause the fear and can cause resistance. You also talked about the need to be iterative. I like to think of intentional as well as a companion word to that, because so often, as you said, leaders decide 6 months ago that they're comfortable with the change, but they haven't brought people along with them. And what ultimately happens is exactly what you described. People put their heads down and say, oh, this will blow over because something else will catch their attention in 5 months and I don't need to change. I can just sit here and wait for something new to come along. And that lack of intentionality and lack of iteration is what causes the fad that we're often known for. In leadership. Oh, what fad are we paying attention to now? And if you talk to somebody who's been in a company for any length of time, they can really tick off every single program or every single area of attention they were asked to do something with, and they have no idea whatever happened to it. So some great examples of what leaders need to pay attention to. But then you also talked about the willingness of you and to step up and to say, you know what, I'll step out on that limb. I'll take a risk. I'll set an example. So what caused you to not be fearful about doing that? Because in some organizations, you might go out on that limb and the limb might be cut off.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the public sector, it really helps that I know that unless I'm doing something illegal, I probably won't be fired for going out on a limb. Certainly a massive benefit. But look, we change in our personal lives all the time. Like think about how quickly you pick up new habits and new skills and new interests and you explore them. You look at social media and the different apps that become like the app and you're like, oh, this is it. And then like 2 years later, there's a new one and like everyone's on that one. And like, you've just like picked up new things. Suddenly when you start having finances involved with that, as in I am getting paid for something and like I am being rated on it. And so therefore I don't want to look stupid. That like intrinsic like change that just is occurring in your personal life doesn't carry over to your professional life. And so for me, like I had a Penn State degree. I had an MBA. Afterwards, I was a smart person that felt like I was going to add value to the workplace. If I can't be myself and be a willing driver of change in some capacity, it's probably not the right place for me to work. And so I'd rather go out on a limb, try, fail or succeed, right? I have had failures in driving change as well. And like, if it doesn't work out, or if like they don't want to allow me to, if I can't find the space to do it, or the culture is there that like people at a lower level are not encouraged to show any sort of entrepreneurship whatsoever, then like, it's not the right place for me and I'll go find another job. I was in a decent job market when I started. So like, that's another piece of that I felt I had that availability. But that's something, as you start understanding what drives you and what motivates you, that's what motivated me. I want to be a driver of change. And if I'm not empowered to do so, then like, this is not a company I probably see myself in long-term.
So we have some questions and I'm really excited about, you're giving us a lot of material that's fantastic for our students who are getting ready to enter the workforce. but I want to get to these questions, and we have some more coming in as well. But first, we have one for that's addressing resistance to change. What if your leader is resistant to change or dismissive of your interest in change? What if you do not feel comfortable or unable to go to the next level in your chain of command for guidance on change? Can you make the change from below?
So the traditional change that ends up occurring is top down. The meaningful change that ends up occurring is actually bottom up. And so there are lots of examples that we cited when I was at OECD that talked about bottom up change, where just the norms in society have changed that affect your workplace. And like, look what's happening right now. You're going to have leaders resistant to a virtual workforce that have no choice but to adopt and adapt to it. And so like partially it is that like taking a long view, you will end up winning if it's a true like meaningful societal shift. But the other part is, and this is the part that do not quote me on, although this may be recorded.
It is.
Figure out how to test something small and like don't tell other people. As long as there's no finances, you're not doing anything illegal. A lot of the things that I brought to my leader were already tested that I had data to prove that it worked. I knew that they would say no, and just bringing an unfounded idea is not going to be supported generally. Like leaders want data and want assurances if they're going to make an investment in something that it's going to succeed, regardless that success with change management is only like 35% of the time. They like to think it's higher, but that's like what it is from the latest like McKinsey review. So, but yeah, so I would just often like do things quietly.
Okay.
Nobody, I would just spend extra time. I'd figure out if it worked, if it didn't, how to iterate on it, find trusted people that I could bounce ideas off of and get their opinions. And once I felt I had a good case, then it was time to take it to leadership. They still have the right to shoot it down.
Kind of get buy-in as well, maybe?
Yeah, so like build a coalition, like
Mhm.
ask people that may have the ear of the leader more so than you do for their feedback. Get that coalition of the willing, get the people that will be able to influence, and it still won't always work out. I wouldn't say that if you go to a leader with a fail-safe plan and they shoot it down, that immediately means the leader is resistant. It may just be weird timing. It may just be the specific idea. If you go with like 5 really good ideas and they don't accept any of them, then you can start saying like, hey, like this leader may just be resistant to any change that they don't think of. But yeah, I would say like that's the way to get around it, is prove it out individually in your team way before you go to leadership or try to go over their heads.
So speaking of failure, and I know we've talked about this before when we had a separate meeting, but we have a great comment here in the chat. There is a lot to learn in failing. It's a great way to be intentional about building resilience. Resilience is helpful in navigating change. And I know that's something that, Kevin, you talked to Catherine and I about before. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so you learn a lot more from failures than successes. And the reason I say that is you reflect on failure. You don't really reflect on your successes. You bask in your successes, but you don't like reflect on them. And so a lot of people get very lucky with like, I'm going to do one change, it was successful, and therefore I'm great at change management. And there could have just been a lot of factors that caused you to get very lucky. And when you fail, you don't have that to fall back on. You will do a deep dive and understand what happened. And with that said, it's not just failure that you lead, right? You can learn a lot from watching organizational change fail when you are the one being changed. And so, you know, I watched GSA had a very large scandal that you can Google. Jon Stewart covered it in The Daily Show, making fun of us. That I got to watch crisis management fail. And I had never been involved in crisis management. I would have likely failed if I was in charge of that as well in that response. But I got to watch what it was like for people to be more worried about their individual jobs than the well-being of the organization, and the organization turn on leadership. That is an amazing lesson to be able to get without me being in any sort of trouble or challenge. And so like I got to learn so much about crisis communication from that and like crisis management. And so take those opportunities, not just when you are leading them, but when you see things happening around you, to learn from those, and learn from the people that have gone through it before. We oftentimes, if you are asked to lead change, like to blow past anyone that has said we've done this before and it didn't work. But that is really valuable insight for why it didn't work. You may still end up like pushing through, but we oftentimes just ignore the people that are contrarian to our own view rather than listening to them. And they have some really insightful information as well.
Great. We have another question here. And again, I want to continue to encourage our listeners and viewers to keep bringing those questions forward. This one is about organizations and the different types of organizations that change. Through organizations, is it easier for corporations or nonprofits to change? So public sector, private sector, government, I would go, depending on which kind of sector, who's it easier to set forth change in?
I wouldn't say one is necessarily easier than the other. I think they have different motivations and different opportunities for when change happens.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So my wife has been in multiple like really world-renowned nonprofits, and they just, without naming who they are, like they sucked at change management. Like they were just awful at changing. And partially it was because they had no one with any skill sets there. They hired people based on their passion for the specific mission, rather than people that have the skills to actually run an organization. And like there were some distinct challenges there. In the public sector, you have massive opportunities for change. I know everyone says the government doesn't change, but look, every 4 years or 8 years, there is just a massive opportunity to re-look at how you are operating and what your goals are and what your principles are and how you are working, that like you don't get in the private sector. Government is not seen as innovative, and yet like you look at some of the innovations that are happening today that are built upon government innovations, including your cell phone and satellites and all of these different pieces that government is helping fund. So the opportunities there are generally set by politicians or set by transitions, but like you can really do some massive changes and like really meaningful things in government if you time it right. On the private sector, what I have seen and worked with is primarily around finances, right? Like your job is to maximize profit. And therefore, because you are trying to maximize profit, if you are struggling or if you are searching for a new opportunity, there are abilities to change, but it's generally based on efficiency, effectiveness, which are related to money. And can you put a dollar sign on this change and how it will benefit the company? Those are at a very high level, right? Like if you are at Johnson & Johnson and you're at like 100,000 person company, there are some motivations to change at that lower level. Beyond just that intrinsic shareholder value. But those are kind of the different levels and different ways in which change can occur. So I wouldn't say one is better or worse. They are just very different, but they can all happen very quickly and very dramatically if given the opportunity.
Great.
And I would imagine, Kevin, some of that also then comes right back to the leader. In terms of how they choose to approach that change and how they set the stage for change. And we've talked a little bit about fear and how one overcomes fear. And you mentioned doing some pilots and gathering kind of an informal coalition. Talk to us a little bit more about how you identify that informal group of people that you might want to go to before you test an idea with leadership.
Yeah, so the number one advice that I give anyone starting a job is to ask an obscene amount of questions to the point that like people consider you annoying. But in doing so, you end up finding out what your unofficial organizational structure is very quickly. Because as much as there's a hierarchy with an organization with a leader at the top, there is an unofficial one where it is not bound by your hierarchical organization. And so if you start asking questions of like, who would be the best person to answer this or that, or who do you go for advice, you will end up and we did this at a couple of the changes I've done, you end up with this group of like 10 to 12 people that just everyone mentions. And so those are your influencers in the organization. So if you really want to affect change and you know people will listen to, they won't listen to you based on your numbers of years there or experience. If you get those people on board, those are the people that, one, are likely to be open to ideas because they are the ones that are helping influence the organization and push them a certain way. But they're the ones that can also help drive your ideas. Because the one thing that I think is really important in driving change from the bottom is, how do you make it about the idea and not you? Right? You are not going to be able to represent your idea at every level of your organization at every point in it. So who are the people that will carry your message for you? And so choosing those people and making sure those are the right people is something that is actually relatively easy to do. But most people don't do it. They don't think about that unofficial group of like, who are the key influencers that I need to be able to carry this message when I am not in the room.
Probably great advice for whether you are in the trenches or you are a leader.
Yeah.
Because as we know, leaders are often removed from people that have to live with the change that they're proposing, and hearing the implications or the unintended consequences early on are a great way of gaining acceptance of change. And I'm thinking a little bit about what you just talked about with respect to the shift that's coming regarding the remote workforce. And I had an opportunity to talk to a company leader the other day who just can't wait to get back in the workplace and can't wait to be back on planes and be out visiting client sites, but is totally baffled that 80% of their employees don't share that same sentiment. And that kind of push and pull, that struggle of not understanding. And when they started to dig a little deeper, they started to really begin to understand the hardships that their employees face with being on the road 3 weeks out of the month and not living in their homes and not being with their families. And now over the last 6 months, they've proven that they can be productive and still have the balance that they're looking for. And so it's going to be really interesting to watch how some of our big companies tease that out going forward.
And you're
just going back to the old way is probably not going to happen at this point.
I mean, things have just changed, right? Like I had to go on a plane once over since April, when I started at Column. Last month went on a plane, went to Colorado. Like if someone coughs in an airport or a plane, like everyone turns and runs away. Like things have changed. And yes, there are going to be people that resist them, just as there are people that resist any change, and there are going to be laggards, and there are going to be early adopters, and that's all great. But eventually, like societal shifts happen, right? So the big one that happened while I was in government is I was running communications during the time of the rise of social media, right? And so us releasing things through press release and judging our success based on how many people looked at it was no longer a relevant metric when someone was tweeting like I like toast and getting 100,000 clicks. Like like our message that was supposed to go to citizens that we're getting like 1,000 people and thinking we're successful just like isn't relevant anymore. And so again, the idea of like testing and making sure I wasn't doing anything illegal, I just created a Twitter account for my government agency or my subset of the government agency, and like posted our press releases through there and like tagged people that we wanted to do it. And eventually government was like, okay, like we don't want to do this, but clearly this is happening. So now we will like adapt to it and make some rules. But it started like creating the Twitter account and then just like handing it over to the government when they wanted it. But yeah, so it's just like adapting to change, but change is foisted upon people whether they like it or not. And eventually like you'll have to adapt, or like you go away, especially in a private business where if you can't get the best employees anymore and people don't want to work for you because like you don't offer the same work-life balance that people are desiring, then like you'll have other challenges.
Well, you tweaked one. Oh, I'm sorry, Whitney. One more thing that you tweaked on my mind, Kevin. You mentioned working in Paris and working domestically. And do you see any difference between working abroad or working domestically with resistance to change? Or is it just a we as people, the way we're wired?
Oh, massive, massive difference. There are definitely like cultural things as well. I mean, look, the French like strike. It's what they do, right? I was working there for like 3 months and like the metro shut down for a month. Like that is their way to prove a point to government and has traditionally gotten government to move. Um, and like some people culturally are very beholden to cultural norms that have been developed over centuries. And so you are seeing different challenges. Like everyone faces like societal challenges. Some are just very different than others, and some are unwilling to move and transition. And like you can start seeing some of that in the US as well. But I feel it's much more divided here, where we also have more early adopters and more people that are willing to take change and use it as a means to like build a new business or to innovate, where other places it's like much stronger resistance. And like it goes to cultural and how they were raised and like what they were taught growing up.
So
Which
all
again,
good important things to understand
yeah,
in that guiding coalition and as you're building up your pitch for change.
yeah, trying to do change management in Japan or France is very challenging, as like just cultural norms are just so powerful there.
We want to remind everyone that we still have some time left for your questions. So be sure to use that Q&A box and send us your questions about navigating organizational change. You know, Kevin, no matter what side of change you're on, we've been talking a lot about being the leader, initiating the change, or on the receiving end of change and trying to figure out how to manage it. That change process. How do we, on both of these ends of it?
Yeah, so from the leader perspective, and we've all three of us now, you, Catherine, and myself have all touched on this.
Mm-hmm.
As a leader, like you get comfortable with the change before you announce it to everyone else. And at that point, you forget about the entire process that you went through to get to the point where you are comfortable with it. And so having that empathy for understanding that you are asking people to change, and when it comes to changes that they're maybe worried about job security or finances or looking dumb and getting a bad rating, which could affect their hireability in future jobs, like you have to have that empathy that like these things are happening, and you may not even be able to reassure them that it won't, right? Like, especially in private business, some of these changes are because like the business isn't doing that well, which means that like you can't offer like sympathy of like, hey, I know you're going through this, but like there's nothing to worry about. Maybe there legitimately is something to worry about. So it's more just being able to understand what people are dealing with and tailoring your messages appropriately. And so I think there is a lack of empathy generally from leaders after those first like 2 weeks to a month. They're like, ugh, let's just get on to the next thing. And forgetting the path that they went through. Empathy for each other. Like just because you may be a rising star in an organization that wants to like take this opportunity by the horns and run with it, if you are seen as the person that's doing that by running over other people and showing that they are not being like team players or are not adapting, you will have a not sustainable path, right? Like it will work probably that one time. You will not have champions with you in the future if you ever need that support again. And so it's that understanding of constantly that like you are asking people to change in a manner that they didn't necessarily have the ability to like form the like how it is going to change, why it's going to change. And I'm seeing that a lot with newspapers right now. So we work with owners to say adopt this technology because like we can help you make more money. We can do things faster, provide a better customer experience for the people that place public notices in your paper. And they're in, right? Like they say yes, they're good. And then the next person I have to talk to is the person that's actually responsible for executing. And they have a process of which they are very comfortable with. It may not be perfect, but like they know the ins and outs of it and they know everything about it. And suddenly we're going to say your entire process is in the trash and you're just going to use ours. And that is like not a fun moment. And so if you just go in very confident and saying, this is how it's going to be, and also you're probably in your 40s or older, and there's a 20-something-year-old telling you to just change and adopt technology, like it's not going to go well. And we've had our failures thus far have been active resistance from a legals person that says, that just like holds it up and will tell the publisher and the owner that like this isn't ready, and the publisher will be like, oh, okay, like I don't want to lose this person, so like I'll just listen to them. And so if you're not there as a understanding shoulder, yes, you want to continue to push them forward, but you want to make them feel like it's a partnership where like you're working on this together and you are there to support them. I always joke that like they have my phone number and I can be their help desk, and they're like phone a friend for the first couple months while this is getting on board. But the one that I learned the most, or the one that my colleagues referenced the most, was we were working with a major publisher, and the woman was clearly nervous and not comfortable with what we were presenting. And I simply just stopped everyone on our side from talking for a second and just said, like, how are you doing? And like, how are you feeling about this? Like, ignore that the technology works and it's great, but like, how are you doing emotionally with this change? And she was like, I am not doing well. I'm really struggling. I'm nervous. Technology typically doesn't work for me. I'm very comfortable with what I do. And like, this makes me really nervous. Am I going to be out of a job because this replaces me? Is this going to like make me fail and I will get yelled at by my boss? And just being able to put that out there changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. We made it less about the technology and more about our support and our training, and could partner with her for how to get her comfortable rather than just like, let's train you in the technology. And so I think acknowledging that people are people, which can be really hard to do in a large organization. If you're a leader leading 15,000 people, you can't have that one-on-one with everyone. Mm-hmm. But that's where you need to be the example for all of the other managers in your organization to be that type of person. And so I think that is just a really critical part of change that not only helps you get over a single change, but helps you build a coalition that future changes, like people may more blindly follow your changes, right? As Catherine said, like if you get foisted a change and you don't know why and the rationale, you may like not be very trusting of it. But if they've done that the right way 3 or 4 times and you trust them, if something happens that they just need you to change, no questions asked, you're probably willing to do it because like they have that capital with you. And so I think that's really important and often underserved as a skill set is, having built up your empathy muscle to be able to do that effectively.
Kevin, it really kind of reminds me of how important communication is to this whole process. And I think it's probably one of the most under discussed or perhaps under anticipated in terms of the actual amount of communication that needs to happen. And so often, I think we expect that people will just get it. And we haven't taken the time. And the key word there is time. The fact that you were willing to stop a process and check in with the person who needed to accept it on the other side did slow down your process. And I think as leaders and participants, sometimes we're so bent on getting it done so we can move on to the next thing that we often don't take the time. But with that communication comes the building of trust and the creation of that emotional bank, if you will, that allows people to give you a pass the next time you ask for something. And I think and Cotter says this, I think under communicate by 10 times 100 times because we think that if I just told them once, they understand and they'll get it. So I guess, the fact that you were able to step back and take that time with your client speaks to a culture that encourages innovation and allows you to do that. And I guess I'm thinking about, as we have many of our listeners who are looking at their first jobs or perhaps in companies right now where they're not sure how much the company values the time and their talent for innovation. So how do you figure that out? How do you figure out if where you are has a culture that encourages what you're suggesting or if you're not in the right place.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer. Because one, like people will present and brute force this appearance of a culture that like they want to be seen as. And so it's like very easy to get tricked by it and like end up in an organization that doesn't match your values, culture, whatever you want to call it. The other part is we like to mix up culture with like lack of diversity, where like everyone is like us, and so therefore like I feel comfortable here, and therefore comfortable equals the culture that I want, rather than actually like what am I trying to achieve. So I think some of the important pieces are one, like let's start with the baseline of like you feel comfortable that you're not asked to be doing anything unethical, or you're not being set up for failure to the point that like you don't have the skills for the job that they hired you for, and so therefore it's just not going to work out, or your boss is abusive, like any of those things. Let's push all of those aside. When you are starting a job, if you are forming a very strong opinion in the first 3 months, you've probably not given it enough time. And I say that because like I have started now, I've switched jobs even within the same organization, like every 2 to 3 years at this point. And the first 2 months, I have no idea what the hell is going on. Like it takes you 90 days to understand like what is actually happening in an organization, no matter how smart and good you are. And so that first part should be very open and being very focused on observing. How do people interact with each other? How do leaders interact with the people that they are working with in their organization, and their subordinates? Like, how do all those interactions happen? How does change happen? Where is it being motivated from and driven from? Are the people that you are working with going to make you better? And like, what are you looking to get out of this job? Look, if you want, I'm about to say some not very PC things, but like if you want to go work for McKinsey and BCG to get it on the resume, as like because it is great to have McKinsey and BCG on your resume, Boston Consulting Group for those that don't know, great, go do it. You won't be in a year or 2 years a leader that's driving change within internally your organization, but it's great for your resume. And if that's what you want to get out of it, fantastic. If you want to get out of it that you're leading change, if you want to get out of it that you are have the ability to get promoted early, then like that's what you should be looking out for, right? So it's always, you should be very intentional, using your word from earlier, Catherine, of like what you're hoping to get out of this. So I went from a 4,000 person international organization based in Paris, flying around the world, to a 10-person tech startup, like venture-backed tech startup in DC, doing just customer experience, like this little narrow focus of everything that I was focused on before, because it's the part of the job that I enjoyed the most, something I wanted to intentionally focus on. And I really wanted to be part of a really small dynamic team where I have done that as part of larger organizations, but not as a single entity. If those things change and my desires continue to be that, and the organization shifts where it's not that, maybe it's time to move away. If I had come in and it turned out that the leader dictated everything and everyone else just followed, then it's not a very dynamic environment, and I probably would have left. So it's what do I want to get out of it? Being focused on really observing and learning for those first 90 days, and then starting to see how you can weave into it, and if that's something that you see a future in. I know that's not like a super specific answer or like a definitive yes, no, because I don't think there is one for stuff like this. But that's what's worked for me.
And you're clearly pointing out what are some things culturally that people should look for, and some of the questions that they could be asking around how is change pushed in the organization. What is your view? Tell me about the last change that happened here, and how was it accepted? How did it happen? And I think there are lots of keys within the answer to that question, even at the interview level, that might begin to give you a sense of what's the culture.
Yeah, and I want to drive in 1 second on emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout education for most people, there is a clear answer for the culture that you should want. I want a culture where I own things and I feel empowered and I have the ability to get promoted quickly and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out like when you go into the work environment, all those things that are told as like the environment you should be working in may not be the best one for you. And so being very keen to understanding what excites you versus what gives you anxiety is something that I think is really, really important. There were plenty of people. So I ran part of our intern program. They weren't interns, like entry level program for government, where everyone said they wanted their own project and they wanted to own it and they didn't want anyone's help. So when I got something that I just gave it to them, I didn't think about it much. I didn't help define it for them. I was like, here you go. And like they hated it. And so we are taught that like that's what we want and that's what we should be aiming for. When it turns out for like some jobs, you may actually want a very like meticulous environment that outlines very clearly what some expectations are so you know what success looks like for you. And there's no judgment as to which is better than another. The thing that I emphasize is just understand what parts of jobs excite you, what parts of jobs give you anxiety, what do you feel that you're good at that you want to dig further into, what are some things you absolutely hate, and like use that as a guiding principle for how you make some of these career choices over just what theoretically you have been told you should be doing.
Great. And that's great advice for our students. I wanted to ask any additional advice you might have for our new SPP or Penn State students as they graduate and what they can do with respect to change as they're starting those first positions.
Yeah, so I always say like say yes to everything. I don't know if anyone's seen that Jim Carrey movie, like Yes Man. I maybe myself here, but like it really does work. Like at some point you will hit your limit where you have said yes so many times that you are stretched so thin that like things fall apart. But for the most part, it takes a while to get there, and it's good to know where that limit is by stretching yourself to it. But you open yourself up to so many possibilities. Like if you're going into a big organization, there are so many special projects and opportunities to get involved. And sorry, that is, I thought I turned off my apps. I clearly did not.
It's okay.
So
we're all human.
that was our live chat app, which I thought I had turned off. But the idea that you can say yes to things and get exposed to different groups and like be able to network and build coalitions across an organization or across an industry, right? There are so many groups. If you go to a major city like in DC, if you want to be a part of anything involving international anything, there is a group for it in DC. And so that helps you expand some of your coalition. Let's say you're really anchored on, I want to be involved in international politics. Well, there's approximately 10,000 groups that do that in DC. So like finding the right one can be really, really tough, and building that coalition either across an industry or just simply across an organization can be really valuable in trying to figure out what those next moves are, and just expose you to different things. I didn't do design at Penn State. I didn't do customer experience or citizen experience at Penn State. I just said yes to everything and ended up getting to do those things and found out I really love them. And one of my regrets at Penn State was actually not doing more sociology stuff, because it turns out like I love sociology and I did not know that at the time. And so like the idea that your education is over once your formal schooling is over is a myth. Continue to expose yourself to new things, continue to see what excites you and motivates you, and like try to align that with your career as much as possible. I'm not fully on board with the like do what you love and you never work a day in your life. Like I'm on the flip side of that, of like if you do what you love, like you're working every second of the day. But I do believe that like you can find things that excite you about work and make you wake up excited to like gain new experiences. And if you're having more good days than bad days, then you're doing a lot better than other people in the professional world. And like you shouldn't take that for granted.
Any final words of advice? That was great advice for our future graduates, but any additional advice that you would offer to whether we know people who are current professionals or just looking for that first job?
Yeah, so two things. One is like the most basic advice I can say is like if you want to LinkedIn with me and look at my connections and use those as help, like I always volunteer that for organizations like this. I'm a big believer in oh man, what's the book called? It's from Grant at Harvard, but it's basically this Adam Rifkin thing for 5-minute favors. That
Mhm.
if you are asked to do a 5-minute favor, regardless of what it is, like you should just do it. No questions asked. And so this is my 5-minute favor that I offer to everyone is like LinkedIn with me. And if you find someone interesting that you want to connect to that I can provide a connection to, I'm happy to do so. So that's one piece of advice. When people offer that to you, don't think they're just being nice, like take advantage of it. The second one that I would just say is like be know how you feel around ambiguity. Like of all things that I think are a key decision point of like what you want to do with your career, the ambiguity one is probably the most important, which is do I feel comfortable not having things very well defined? And do I succeed in that space or not? Because in the startup world right now, like where I am, I have no idea what my day is going to look like. We kind of know where we want to go, but like we are pivoting and iterating seemingly weekly. And so if you're not comfortable in that type of environment where it's like not clear if you're even doing well for large chunks of time, um, then that maybe that's not the right environment for you and maybe something more structured is. And there's nothing good or bad about that. But that has been the biggest factor that I've seen in people succeeding or failing is not understanding how they feel about like a gray area, about this just like ambiguous blob that some people see it as an opportunity and some people see it as an issue and a challenge and an obstacle. And so viewing that really helps provide some clarity, like where you want to go and what type of job you want.
Great advice to end on. Kevin Richmond, thank you so much for being with us today and for all of your great advice. And to everyone who attended today, thank you for all of your questions. We hope you'll join us on Wednesday, November 11th at 11:30 when we talk about the power of mentoring. You can watch past events from this and other series from the School of Public Policy at publicpolicy.psu.edu. I'm Whitney Sheridan with Catherine Baumgardner for all of us with the School of Public Policy. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.